Hi, and welcome to the first video in this series of videos about fine art photography. In this video, I'm going to cover a bit of fine art photography history, going up to about the 1980s. I'm going to zip through it as fast as I can, not make you too crazy, although you know I can go off on tangents easily. I want to give you a sense of where fine art photography came from and how closely related photography is to fine art from the very beginning. A little bit of the twists and turns along the way. Fine art is a complicated subject in and of itself, and photography has a very complex relationship to photography. But it's really fascinating. And I hope that once we get through these videos and you get working on your projects, that you'll really enjoy having some of the freedom to explore your own ideas and maybe try something completely new. Okay, well, let's get into a little bit of the history of fine art photography. Right now, you're looking at an image of an early camera obscura, 16th or 17th century. Not quite sure where this is from. This is an engraving, of course, and not a photograph, because photography had not yet been invented. I'm showing this because I want to point out that even the actual origins and invention of photography were closely related to art and the fine arts. That is, art for exhibition rather than art for commercial purposes. So we see inside of this cutaway diagram of the movable or transportable room-sized camera obscura an artist who is using this device to help him get the correct perspective and tonal value of the landscapes outside. So from the very beginning, optics and photography were a big part of, were used heavily by artists. Now, if we zip forward just a tiny bit, go into I believe, the 17th century, we're looking at a painting, not a photograph, but a painting by the Dutch artist, very famous Dutch artist, Johannes Vermeer. And he was quite famous for these beautiful light-filled depictions of mostly interior space and very beautifully and realistically depicted. It's widely thought that Johannes Vermeer used a portable, sort of a tabletop camera obscura with a lens to pre-visualize and to lay out the basics for these scenes. And we see the clues in this all over the place. The quality of the light is very striking, the realism, but also things like this chair sitting in the corner. When somebody is making a painting from scratch, they would probably sketch it out and include such an object whole, or they would take it out completely. You wouldn't see it sort of cut off in the middle in this sort of strange way. This is the way that a camera frame inadvertently cuts off the corner of something. And we tend to go with that for our camera composition. We accept that now. But at the time, that was quite unusual. You also can see that the lens that he used, if this is what was going on, was maybe a little bit wide because the chair is a little bit bigger than the objects in the background. It has this sense of camera distance. So we see that artists were very likely using optical camera devices before the invention of photography. Well, let's go to the invention of photography. This is another painting. I apologize, but this is a study, a painting by Louis Daguerre. And Louis Daguerre was one of the early inventors of photography. He made paintings like these studies as preparation for making these giant interior paintings on a material called a scrim for his diorama. These were huge scale, spectacular images that people would pay money to come in and experience. They were painted on a material that could be backlit or frontlit. It was like being in a really amazing theater. It's also super time consuming and expensive to make these large paintings, and he was looking for a quicker way to do it. So he got involved with the development of photography. And he did manage to invent the first practical version of photography called the Daguerreotype. And this is an early Daguerreotype. They really are quite beautiful. They're silver-plated copper, sensitized with silver nitrates, exposed to light, and developed over mercury vapor. Yeah, it was a little toxic. But they were really beautiful. Unfortunately, they were also very small. and it didn't do Daguerre a whole lot of good. He made some nice photographs, he made a little bit of money, he got very famous, but he was never able to use this process for his diorama. Now, there was another guy named Henry Fox Talbot, another terrific artist, maybe. Actually, Henry Fox Talbot was British. He was what we call landed gentry. He had money. He was, he grew up with money. He didn't have to work, so he was an inventor and a tinkerer. And one of the things he was working on was optical devices. He also really wanted to be able to draw, and he really was quite terrible at it, as you can see from this drawing. He used things like a camera lucida and a camera obscura to help, but it didn't really do much good for him. He wanted to be able to capture the images that he saw directly. And he developed a negative positive process called the Calotype. And this is using a paper negative. And so he would make, sensitize paper with silver nitrates, expose it, and develop it, and then place it face down on another piece of sensitized paper. So he was doing, conceptually, he was way ahead of Daguerre, but people thought the process looked a little bit sort of mushy and not quite as dramatic as the daguerreotypes. Now, later on, I'll show you an artist in another video. I'm going to show you an artist who still works with calotypes, but that's another story. Now, this is the first of what we maybe consider to be a fine art photograph. There was a lot of debate early on in photography, and it still comes up, about whether or not photographs can really be art. That is, they're just made by a machine. So is that really art? Well, this guy, Oscar Friedlander, was determined to prove to the world that photography could be art. And so he made this sort of early, strange version of Photoshop. That is, he shot about 36 different photographs and montaged them together in the dark room, just exposing them together. And he called this the two ways of life. It's the dilemma of a young man who is either going to go drink wine and hang around with naked women or go work and hang around with clothed women. Anyway, it was a little bit of a failure in his time, but Queen Victoria loved it. But conceptually, it was a really important move forward. Now, there were many ways that painting and photography came together. Mostly at this time, photography is trying to look like painting, and so it's emulating paintings. There were a group of painters called the PreRaphaelites. They were making these very romantic and what were considered very avant-garde paintings in the late 19th century. This is by a painter named Waterhouse, who was one of the more famous of the PreRaphaelites. And he was part of a group that included a woman named Julia Margaret Cameron, who had inadvertently picked up a camera and was teaching herself how to use it. She was very influenced by the PreRaphaelites. She loved to do metaphors, to create these kind of romantic avant-garde scenes. And she was one of the first people to recognize that what we think of as the flaws of the camera, what people thought were the flaws of the camera, such as the motion and the blur, actually really gave these photographs this really beautiful feeling. And she didn't feel the need to composite. She just let the camera do the work. So we continue to see this sort of funny relationship between painting and photography, which I think goes on now, where we have painters such as Edgar De Gouw, who's very interested in photography. He takes photography, he learns it, but he also doesn't think it's an art, but then it really shows up in his work. Here's one of his pastels of dancers, and you can see them sort of mid-gesture, cut off at this strange venue. They're backstage, they're not on stage. It's a really photographic way of looking at this subject. Now, conversely, you have people like Robert Damashii, who is a photographer who's making more traditionally painterly versions of the same subject, the ballerinas. So you have these two, painting and photography, sort of influencing each other back and forth. Now, Damashii was a pictorialist, and the pictorialists were a group of very devoted photographers who were trying very hard to convince people that photography was art. They were doing it primarily by trying to make photographs look like paintings. Now, interestingly enough, what really needed to happen with photography is it had to actually get out of this relationship, to paintings and become something of itself. And surprisingly enough, it was a scientist who revealed what cameras could do that paintings did not. This is a photograph, very elaborate photograph, by a scientist named Etienne Jules Marey in France. He was not interested in art, but he was interested in the science of motion. And you can see from the description, this is a man in a black suit with a white stripe down the side, and he's photographed many dozens of times walking across the stage. So this is a photographic diagram of human motion, if you can imagine that. It's really fascinating, and you might not be surprised to learn that artists found this especially fascinating. A man named Marcel Duchamp actually was directly inspired to make this early painting, nude descending the stairs. And what he was thinking about when he made it was the Marey's work, and the fact that in Marey's photographs, the same object existed in multiple places at the same time within the photograph. And this is something that cameras did that artists had not been doing, and that we don't quite imagine in our daily moments. So the camera began to create a kind of a surreal or alternate space for thinking about the world. The camera was its own kind of creative tool. There were other photographers who really became interested in this sort of alternate view. This is a vortograph by Alain Langdon Coburn, also early 19th century. And he probably did this through a kaleidoscope, maybe with prisms. This is actually just throwing light onto photo paper in various ways. Nobody's quite sure how he's done this, but a lot of contemporary artists have been very influenced by the vortographs. There were other ways that photographers were starting to change the way that cameras operated. And one of them was by playing with the camera's perspective. Now, this also has a social implication. This is by a Russian photographer, or an early Soviet photographer, I should say, Alexander Rodchenko. And he made a number of these photographs by moving the camera up and down, tilting it, twisting it. Doesn't seem that crazy to us, but this was a very new way of thinking. So in here, we're looking up the ladder at the proletariat, or the working man, who's moving up and looking down at us below. It's both a metaphor and a photograph. This is by Hannah Hawk. She was part of a group of artists known as the Dada artists, just slightly later than the early Soviet Union. But this is in Europe and the United States between World War I and World War II, very divisive time. There were groups of artists that were really exploring the kind of irrationality of the time. And some of them were making photo montages, and these were working with found photos, montaging and collaging them together in different ways. This is called Beautiful Girl, and it depicts the relationship between the way the female body is commodified, and so it's comparing her to a BMW car. Another group of artists who merged at that time, a little bit later, were the Surrealists. Now, the Surrealists weren't as political as Rodchenko in Russia or as the Dada artists. They were more interested in the human subconscious, and they were interested in the way that photography could express this sort of dream state, or this alternate surreal experience. So this is by Man Ray, who actually did alternate processing in the darkroom to create this interesting study. Another direction for photography at this time was straight photography. And this may seem contradictory because this is all happening sort of at the same time, but there's this moment in the early 20th century when suddenly photographers and photography itself becomes itself. That is, photographers say, what is it that photography can do that painting does not? What is it? What are the characteristics of photography that distinguish it as an art? So for the straight photographers, such as Imogen Cunningham, It was its ability to depict objects very, very precisely and coherently. It was its detail and its depth of field and its descriptive possibilities. For other artists, such as Minor White, again, it was describing the world, but describing it maybe in just a slightly alternate fashion, talking about the internal psyche and even a religious experience. This is an infrared landscape by the artist Minor White. When we move into the mid-20th century, we get into a lot of the availability and the use of a lot of very small cameras, very portable cameras. And we have the emergence of street photography as a fine art, not as a journalistic device, but as fine art. This is a photograph by Lee Friedlander. It's from a series of self-portraits he did by casting his shadow onto other people. And we even have photographers by the very famous, such as the very famous Robert Frank, who are doing what looks like photojournalism, but which is really a social, personal, and artistic comment on the human condition. Robert Frank did a very famous book called The Americans, which depicted both the humanity and also the tensions and the divisions of American life. There were even photographers who were experimenting with the possibility of abstraction. This is Aaron Siskind. He did a series of these amazing close-ups of walls and papers on the walls, flatnesses, that really were inspired by and inspired the abstract painters. It was amazingly long before color photography entered into the fine art photography realm. This is the man who put color photography into the fine art map. This is William Eggleston, who worked with a combination of sort of sly humor, composition, really an attention to color and detail and form, but also with his own very silent but very particular comment on American life. Now, this is the last slide in this portion. This is the end of the history section, and then I'm going to move into contemporary. This is a photograph by Cindy Sherman, and in my mind, this photograph is emblematic of our shift from all other types of photography into current conceptual photographic forms. Cindy Sherman started out as a painter. She was at art school and she was trying to paint her ideas. And she picked up a camera and she thought, you know, not only is this camera going to be faster, but it will make a lot more sense for what I'm trying to show. She was very interested in this sort of malleability of history, of identity and idea. This is one of her history paintings. And this is Cindy Sherman is the star of every single photograph that she makes. So that is Cindy Sherman. And she's dressed up in an historical costume, framed like an historical painting. And one of the things that I will really point out to you is that it's, of course, very, very obvious, and she intentionally did it this way, that she's in a fake costume. She's in a fake costume, but on the other hand, it's a very physical, real thing in a real photograph. So she's really getting at this very strange tension between what is fake and what is real and what is absolute, what is history and what is present tense. Okay, that is going to get us started on conceptual photography and is going to lead us into the presentation I'll do next on contemporary photography. Bye-bye for now.